every moment, you choose who you are and how you want to live your life. It's your ultimate power and your inescapable responsibility. You are the master of your reality. It doesn't always feel that way, though, right? I mean, too often we believe the awful fictions of our fears. We believe our misguided assumptions and our faulty leaps of logic. We surrender to self-limitations. We misperceive success and value in our lives. We misperceive the force of luck. We perpetuate our insecurities and vanities. And we fail to listen to each other and to truly listen to our own hearts. So how do we take back control, creating the lives we want for ourselves with awareness and accountability? That's the question we consider in this interview series, Mastering Your Reality. We consider the question with remarkable people who clearly have a lot to teach us on the subject. Today's guest is one such person. Tali Sharot is the director of the Affective Brain Lab and a professor of cognitive neuroscience at University College in London. She studies how motivation and emotion govern our everyday decision-making, our memories, our ability to learn, and our expectations about our world and the future. She studies the brain mechanisms underlying these things in an effort to encourage behavioral changes that drive improved well-being. Put more simply, she studies these things to teach us how we can master our realities, how we can create the lives we want. Her latest book, The Influential Mind, just came out. By all accounts, it is absolutely phenomenal. I encourage you to read it. I certainly intend to do so. Professor Sharot, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. If you're okay with it, I'd like to start with a quote of yours, something you recently wrote in The Guardian in a great piece. Folks, as you're listening to this, remember this is coming from a literal brain scientist, okay? So you wrote, people are not driven by facts. Facts are not enough to alter beliefs, and they are practically useless in motivating action. Instead, our desires are what shape our beliefs. We need to tap into these motivations in order to make change within ourselves or in others. That's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah, so maybe a few caveats before. So people sometimes generalize this beyond what is meant. So one thing to make clear that we do need data to figure out what reality is and what the facts are. So as a scientist, obviously this is what I do, right? I gather a lot of data, I analyze it to try and figure out what the truth is. And also, facts are very useful at changing people's minds when they already have the same point of view in general. So if you're talking to someone who generally agrees with what you're saying and generally comes from the same point of view, then facts and figures would be helpful. Where it's not helpful is exactly those instances where someone has a very strong different opinion, or a lot of times it's not helpful in motivation. As the example is, we all know what's right for us in terms of what we should eat and what we shouldn't eat, and we should exercise, and smokers know that they shouldn't smoke. But it's those instances where facts and figures are not extremely helpful in changing behavior. And many times we find that things that are a bit, seem peripheral and maybe surprisingly powerful in changing those behaviors.
Do you have any examples you might share with us?
Yeah, so if you take again smoking as an example, people who already smoke, the warnings on cigarette packets have very little impact. They may deter people who don't smoke, but people who already smoke, that really doesn't have much of an effect. And there's studies showing that simply giving people a small monetary reward, a few dollars for every day that they don't smoke, has much more impact than warning them of all these terrible things that can happen with smoking, like lung cancer, for example. So those studies have been done in the UK. There are other studies similar where you get people to start exercising and eating healthily, again, by giving them small monetary rewards, rather than telling them, well, if you don't do this, you will be obese, you will have diabetes. Those kind of warnings about the further future negative outcomes don't seem to be as impactful as the immediate rewards. And the examples that I gave you are monetary rewards, but we know that also positive feedback helps quite a bit. Or these like little likes on Facebook. People go out of their ways to get more likes on Facebook, right? And it seems odd that, even charity giving, it can be driven by likes on Facebook and not necessarily by the um, the thought that we need to help others. So and it's not that we think we don't, but these little things push us even without us realizing it.
Fascinating. So, when you talk about driving change to improve well-being, teasing that apart a little bit, I wonder: are you speaking towards greater awareness and understanding of our motivations and desires, or in some instances maybe working to change our motivations and desires?
Um, well, what we do is we really study the basic mechanisms. So we really want to know how people make a decision, how do they form a belief, um, does this information, is that processed differently from that kind of information? And we want to know that from a very from a scientific level of understanding the systems in our brain, like a biological level, and we want to know it from a cognitive level. So we really do very basic stuff. But the idea is that if we can describe these basic mechanisms, then people will have better understanding of themselves, of their mind, of how they're thinking, of why they're doing what they're doing. That awareness on its own is very helpful. And two, people may say, well, if this is a mechanism, can we use it to change people's behavior? Maybe by changing policy, the kind of nudge approach. To figure out what the correct nudges should be, it's helpful to know what the mechanisms are. So we work on the mechanism level. We have maybe recommendations of what one can do to change behavior, but we really work with the first step.
Fascinating. One of the things that I saw in looking at some of your work, you described sort of one line of inquiry as trying to figure out how, when, and why we deceive ourselves. And I thought that was interesting. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so almost all of us, with the exception of people who have depression and maybe some others, but most of us have an illusion of who we are. So, this is well known that people tend to overestimate themselves in general, on average, of our abilities, our character. People think that in academia. So most people put themselves on the top. I think it's like definitely top 50%, but quite like the majority of people in academia would put themselves in the top few percent of academics. And of course, this is statistically not possible.
Right.
And this is in academia, but it's true in every other field. So it's an illusion that we have of ourselves, and it's not necessarily a bad one because it does motivate us, right? You think you have an amazing podcast, one of the best ones. It drives you to interview more people and to get it out there because you have confidence in what you do, and that's important. It's important for us to try new things, exploration. It's important for us to motivate ourselves and others. However, on the other side, it has these negative consequences where sometimes we can underestimate our risks. If we're overconfident, for example, and as an entrepreneur, it's important to be confident, but on the other hand, you might put too much of your time and money in something that you are not estimating the risks correctly. Same thing with our health. We might not go to medical checks when we need to, and so on. So we definitely have these illusions. Another illusion is very much related. It's called the illusion of control, where on average, we believe we have more control over our life than we actually do. It doesn't mean that we don't have control. It's just that we overestimate it. So there's this classic study where people are put in a room and they have buttons and they press the buttons, and once in a while a light comes on. And there's no relationship between the button pressing and the light. But people quickly create the impression that they are controlling the lights, right? They have the impression that by pressing the button, they are controlling the lights. Someone told me, and I don't know if this, I read this, I think, in some, that, there's when you have a traffic light, you want to cross the road.
Yes.
You have those buttons that you can
Yes.
press. Someone, I read that they don't actually control anything.
I've read the
You
same
press
thing.
them and
I've
they
read
have
this.
no effect.
Yeah, I've read the
But
same thing.
it
The
gives you,
overwhelming majority of them have absolutely no effect. Yeah.
yeah, but it's helpful
Yeah.
because it gives people kind of a conception that they have control over this. I press the button, I've done my thing, now I'm going to wait. Right? So people are more patient when they have a sense that they have control over the situation. So that's the illusion of control. And again, it goes away in people with depression.
Oh well.
And that's interesting because it tells you how needed it is
Yeah.
for well-being, right, and for mental health. And again, we don't want the extreme case where you have these grandiose delusions that are really go beyond um, what's normal, and that can get us into trouble as well.
Is this also kind of a bit of what is at work that sort of allows us to, uh, drive a car at 90 miles an hour, in traffic on a highway without freaking out, realizing exactly, thinking too much about what's going on, this sort of illusion that, yeah, I'm controlling my environment?
Yeah, so I have this example actually in the chapter on control in the new book, where I kind of point out this interesting paradox where things that are quite dangerous do not scare us when we think we're in control.
Right.
So, like driving doesn't scare us, although it's one of the main risks that we have. Accidents are the main kind of causes for dying, as well as medicating ourselves. That's another very dangerous thing, but we're not fearing medicating ourselves because we feel we're in control. On the other hand, things that we don't control scare us a lot, even if realistically they're quite safe, like being on a plane. One of the reasons people are very anxious flying is that we have no control over what's going on, right? Definitely not where the plane is going, but we don't even have control about what to do because we can't even eat what we want because there's not all available things. If we want to get off, we can't. We have to stay where we are, and this lack of control causes anxiety. But in fact, flying is one of the safest things. I mean, you could do definitely relative to driving, for example. There are other things, claustrophobia. People have claustrophobia. Again, it's about control. We're kind of in a closed environment where we can't really move, and so we don't have as much control. So anytime you reduce control, you get anxiety. And when you expand it, you get a sense of agency and it enhances well-being and reduces stress and anxiety.
And there must be some, well, I suppose there's some relationship between control and sort of knowledge or understanding or familiarity. Like the unknown is so problematic for us. Whether or not we are in control, certainly knowledge and understanding seem to be sort of anecdotes or antidotes to fear or whatever.
Right. So yeah, people feel anxious regarding uncertainty, right? We don't know what's going to happen, and that causes us to be anxious for sure. And one reason is, well, if we don't know what's going to happen, we can't plan, right? And as you say, and then we don't have control. So we feel much more comfortable with things that we can predict because we can plan towards them, and then we feel that we have more control over that specific thing. So,
For me as a blind man, it's interesting. I give a lot of talks to organizations and groups and stuff, and one of the things that strikes me, I'll ask folks to maybe put on a blindfold or we'll turn all the lights off, and it's almost palpable. You can feel how anxious and uncomfortable people are. But then I'll say back to the same extent, are you anxious when you're driving 90 miles an hour on the highway? And think about, what risks are you facing right now sitting in this room? Like none. You're perfectly fine. And obviously when you're driving, the converse is true. But the lack of familiarity with blindness, the sort of assumptions we make about how awful it is and how little control we have, it's amazing. It's almost a delusion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I went to one of those restaurants that you eat in the dark. Those? I went twice. The first time was okay. I don't know why. The second time, I just couldn't handle it. And within 2 minutes, I was like, okay, I can't do this, and I went out. Yeah, it's just the feeling is exactly. There's nothing dangerous about it. Obviously, it's a restaurant like anyone else, only with the lights off. Of course, it's not dangerous, but the primitive response that everyone has, maybe to different degrees, is anxiety and even fear. to the point that I felt I had to leave and I couldn't sit there anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I've shared those sort of dining in the dark meals half a dozen times with sighted folks, and I always get a kick out of sitting there and asking people how they're feeling and why they're anxious and sort of feeling the questions they ask me. It's just we're not wired to handle the unknown very well.
Right. Yeah. And then we feel we can't see, therefore we can't
Yeah.
predict what's going to happen. And I mean, I have two young kids, and definitely the number one thing that they fear is the dark.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So, switching gears a little bit, I was struck in reading some of your work and looking at your TED talk. You talk about how we, at our core, we have this desire, right, to communicate, to share ideas, and the studies show, it activates the pleasure centers of the brain and all that kind of stuff, and yet we come at it from this world, this universe of our own, in our own minds, our own perspectives and motivations and history and memories, and we think that we can somehow project that into this sort of foreign world that is the other, and I don't know. To me, it seemed like this almost a little bit of at the risk of sounding dramatic, somewhat of a kind of like a tragic paradox, right? We have this want so badly to communicate what's going on in our world without necessarily realizing that we have to take that first step of sort of translating it into someone else's world if we're to find any success in communication.
Yeah. So I mean, first of all, the first thing is to say that because on average, I mean, our brains are very similar. So the way that different minds and brains work are very, very similar. And so it's not a bad starting point to figure out what someone else wants or needs by using your own brain, right? But I think the difference here is that the context matters. So, if I'm in one position and you're in another position, and now I'm assuming how you feel, as we just talked about, you are can't see and I can see, and so what makes me anxious is not what's going to make you anxious, right? In those kind of ways. So the context matters, and the point was that we are trying to persuade other people based on our own desires and wishes and context, instead of first of all trying to put ourselves and trying to think, well, they see the world a little bit differently because maybe they grew up in a different place, or they're currently in a different age, or a different gender, or have different abilities, and so on, and different goals as well. And so that's kind of the first thing to do, because a lot of times when we try to convince people, we try to convince them according to what is convincing to us,
Sure.
right? So I start the book with the example of Ben Carson and Donald Trump when they're talking about the link to autism. And Ben Carson is a pediatric neurosurgeon, so he's a doctor, and Donald Trump is not a doctor or in the medicine domain or a scientist. But Ben Carson, in trying to convince Donald Trump that there isn't a link between autism and vaccines, he uses the scientist approach because it makes sense to him, right? He says, well, listen, there are all of these articles and all of this data is showing there isn't a link between autism and vaccines. And he says, well, he said Donald Trump is an intelligent man, that's what he said, and he said he will read the data and he will reach the right conclusions. So Ben Carson was assuming that Donald Trump will go about reaching the conclusion just as Ben Carson would, who is a scientist and a doctor, right? But of course, that did not work on the other side. It didn't work on Donald Trump because he had another way of thinking. What was convincing to him is this person that he knew that was working in his company, which had a little child, and the child went to get a vaccine and ended up getting autism. So that was an experience on which he built his conclusion. But I think for a lot of people who were watching that debate, Donald Trump example was more persuasive than Ben Carson's explanation of why we shouldn't believe that there is a link between autism and vaccines. So that's the kind of idea. He came with his knowledge and he assumed that other people would use the same kind of scientific methodological process to get to the truth, and that's not always correct because it does depend what education we have, what training we have, the way we think, and so on, and also what our priors are, what we already believe.
So, as someone who's obviously a very accomplished scientist and researcher, thinker, obviously a very smart person, does any of this make you a little sad? Is it disappointing to you in some way? You know?
It's not anymore. I think perhaps when I started off, I had my first book, The Optimism Bias, and that led to talking a lot to the public, to non-scientists, and not to say like scientists have the same biases. I'm not, not to make that distinction, but it was quite clear that people were not necessarily convinced by my data and figures. They were much more convinced by personal examples. When I could demonstrate to the person themselves that they had the optimism bias, for example. When they could think about an example from someone that they know, from their family, a friend, or so on. And when they had an example of someone in their family and friend who were very not optimistic, or they saw themselves as not optimistic, that was enough to decide that the science is wrong. And it did drive me crazy because I was like, wow, there's all these studies and thousands of pieces of data, and but that was absolutely not convincing for sure. And after a while, my conclusion is well, we need to go along with how the brain works, and that's where the second book came in. The idea is, well, we know all these things about how people are biased and how they process information. This is not new to us, right? This is what behavioral economics is all about. We know this. Well, we should use that. We should think about it and be very mindful of that when we try to convince even the science. Um,
Do you worry that leaves us open to manipulation and quote unquote post factual world, and it all starts to seem a little I guess hopeless on a when you're looking at it from a more pessimistic way.
So first of all, manipulation is when people have malintent.
Right.
So you could use anything for good intent or malintent. Anything that you have, weapons or whatever it is. You could always have someone with malintent using it in a bad way and someone with good intent using it in a good way. We, as you said, we're already in this situation. We're already in this post-factual world. We're already in a place where, because of social media, all these kind of biases were enhanced. But I think in order to get ourselves to a better place, we need to think about these carefully and now say, well, okay, this is the way the brain works. How are we going to go along with it to get us back to where we want to be? Because ignoring this is just going to get us worse. Like saying, no, I don't agree that people are not rational, and I think humans have to be rational, and therefore this is the way I'm going to treat information when I give information to other people. That's not going to be very helpful. And it's not. I mean, it's not necessarily, a lot of these processes and biases are not a bad thing. They are shortcuts that we need to have many times. And our tendency to evaluate things based on emotion, that's what emotion is for. And it usually works quite well. Looking at your facial expressions, I can automatically have, not me, but anyone, automatically and unconsciously, we get a lot of information from facial expressions, which kind of tell us something about what the person is thinking, what they're wanting, So this, and emotional reactions to many things, emotion is information. It's very important information. It's just a way of our brain to take in information in a very fast manner, and it's essential for us to make decisions. So it's not something bad at all. But the brain uses these general rules, and these general rules don't work 100% of the time, right? It's going to work a good amount of time, and they're probably there for good reason, but not all the time. And when you put people in certain contexts, it can actually cause problems.
Well, it seems then that awareness and understanding are really critical first steps. I'm glad that that you're leading the charge on figuring out how to understand these things and explain them.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're hoping to do, and a lot of people, and I think now, I mean, it's been so great with the acknowledgement in the last few years, with the two Nobel Prizes that went to two behavioral economists, one now, one a few years ago. The understanding that this is what humans are, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something we need to be aware of and start taking into account in order to shape the world the way that we want to shape it.
Wonderful. I couldn't have put it better myself. I think that's a great place for us to leave it. I have thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you. I appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate it immensely, and maybe we can speak again someday.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you.